Ram Naam Bhajle.
Picture this. You're 29 years old and your father controls an entire country, but that country is trapped in the 14th century while the world races toward the moon. Your people are dying from diseases that were cured decades ago. Children walk barefoot on dirt roads that lead nowhere. And slavery, actual human bondage, is still legal in 1970, the same year Neil Armstrong walked on the lunar surface. Most people would complain, maybe write angry letters. Sultan Qaboos bin Said did something that still shocks political scientists today. On July 23, 1970, he walked into his father's palace with a handful of loyal guards and staged the most successful bloodless coup in modern history. He didn't just overthrow a government, he imprisoned his own father to save his nation from medieval darkness. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Sultan Said bin Taimur, the father, wasn't just old-fashioned. He was actively hostile to progress. He had banned sunglasses, thinking they were Western corruption. He outlawed radios because music was supposedly immoral. Education beyond basic religious instruction was forbidden. The entire country had exactly 3 schools for a population of 750,000 people. 3 schools. The economy was so primitive that Oman's main exports were dates, fish, and frankincense, literally the same products they'd been trading for over 1,000 years. While Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were building modern cities with oil money, Sultan Said kept Oman's oil wealth locked away, convinced that development would corrupt his people's souls. The national treasury held millions while citizens lived in conditions that would shock medieval peasants. Here's the part that reveals the true character of young Qaboos. He could have staged this coup for personal power, like every other military takeover in history. Instead, his first act as Sultan wasn't to build himself a palace or throw lavish parties. He immediately abolished slavery, making Oman the last nation on earth to end this practice. He opened the borders that his father had sealed shut. He sent students abroad on government scholarships to universities his father had banned them from attending. The transformation happened so fast it seemed impossible. Within 6 months, Oman had gone from 0 hospitals to a national healthcare system under construction. The country that had 3 schools suddenly had hundreds of new educational facilities being built simultaneously. Roads appeared seemingly overnight, connecting villages that had been isolated for centuries. But here's what separates this story from every other revolution you've heard about. Most coups end in bloodshed, chaos, and often leave the country worse than before. Qaboos understood something that Western political scientists still struggle to grasp. Sometimes the most radical act isn't democracy, it's one visionary leader making decisions too bold for committees and too unpopular for elections. Think about it this way. If Qaboos had called for a democratic vote in 1970, what would have happened? A population with 90% illiteracy rates, living under tribal systems unchanged for centuries, suddenly deciding complex questions about education, healthcare, and economic development. The same people who had lived under his father's extreme traditionalism for decades. The uncomfortable truth is that democracy requires a foundation-educated citizens, functioning institutions, shared civic values. Qaboos realized he had to build that foundation first, even if it meant being labeled a dictator by the very Western nations that would later praise Oman's stability and prosperity. Here's the statistic that silences every critic. Under Sultan Qaboos, Oman's Human Development Index, the United Nations measure of quality of life, jumped from among the world's lowest to the top 20% globally. Life expectancy doubled. Infant mortality dropped by 95%. Literacy rates went from 10% to over 95%. And he did all of this while maintaining something, well, truly remarkable, genuine respect from his people. This wasn't fear-based compliance like you see in typical authoritarian states. Omanis genuinely loved their Sultan because they could see, touch, and live the improvements he brought to their daily lives. The coup that shocked the world in 1970 raises a question that, honestly, makes democratic idealists uncomfortable. What if the best leaders aren't the ones who win popularity contests, but the ones willing to make unpopular decisions that transform nations? What if sometimes the most democratic thing you can do is temporarily suspend democracy to build the conditions where it can actually work. Most people think slavery ended with the American Civil War, or maybe with European colonialism in Africa. They're wrong by exactly 100 years. On July 23, 1970, the same day, Sultan Qaboos overthrew his father Oman, became the last country on planet Earth to officially abolish slavery. Let that sink in. While Americans were watching the Beatles break up and protesting the Vietnam War, human beings were still being bought and sold legally in Oman. But here's the part that will make your stomach turn. This wasn't some hidden underground practice. Slavery was so normalized in Oman that slave markets operated openly in major cities. Families passed down human beings like heirloom furniture. Wealthy Omanis considered owning slaves a mark of social status, kind of like owning expensive cars today. The scale was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that between 10 and 15% of Oman's population in 1970 consisted of enslaved people. So that's roughly 75,000 to 100,000 human beings living in bondage. Most were descendants of Africans captured in raids along the East African coast, particularly from what is now Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. But the system had become so entrenched that honestly, some slaves were actually Arabs who had fallen into debt bondage. And others were Baluchi people from what is now Pakistan. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. The international community knew about Omani slavery and did practically nothing. British officials filed reports describing slave markets in Muscat as late as 1969. The United Nations had been established for 25 years. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights had existed since 1948, yet Oman faced no meaningful international pressure, no sanctions, no diplomatic consequences. Why? Well, because Oman's strategic location at the mouth of the Persian Gulf made it just too valuable to antagonize. British and American officials, you see, needed Oman's cooperation to protect oil shipping routes. So they looked the other way while human beings were treated as property. But here's where the story takes a turn that, honestly, reveals the true character of Sultan Qaboos. Within hours of taking power, he issued a decree that didn't just abolish slavery, it made slave ownership retroactively illegal and ordered immediate compensation for anyone who had been enslaved. This wasn't some gradual emancipation process like other countries had implemented. This was instant total liberation. The economic disruption was massive. Entire industries had been built on slave labor. Pearl diving, date farming, domestic service, construction. Wealthy families suddenly had to pay wages to people they had previously owned. The traditional economy collapsed overnight, and Sultan Qaboos knew it would happen. Yet he never wavered, never compromised, never suggested a gradual phase-out period that might have been more politically palatable. He understood something that still escapes many modern leaders. Some moral positions don't allow for convenience or compromise. Here's the detail that shows how deep this system had become embedded in Omani society. Many newly freed slaves didn't know where to go or how to survive in a wage economy. They had been born into bondage, raised as property, never taught to read or given any skills beyond serving their owners. Sultan Qaboos established immediate programs for housing, education, and job training, creating the world's first comprehensive post-slavery reconstruction program. The generational trauma was enormous. Imagine being told at age 40 that you're suddenly free, but you have no money, no education, no legal identity, and no family ties beyond the people who had owned you. Some former slaves actually asked to return to their masters because freedom felt more terrifying than bondage. This is why Sultan Qaboos's decision was so remarkable. He didn't just end slavery, he took responsibility for rebuilding the lives that slavery had destroyed. He spent enormous amounts of government resources creating schools specifically for former slaves and their children. He established job programs that guaranteed employment for anyone transitioning from bondage to freedom. The international response was telling. Instead of celebrating Oman's moral leadership, many Western nations actually criticized the pace of change. British officials worried that rapid abolition would destabilize the region. American diplomats suggested a more gradual approach might be wiser. The very countries that had ended slavery in their own territories a century earlier were advising the last slave nation to go slow. But here's the statistic that puts everything in perspective. Within 10 years of abolition, Oman's former slave population had literacy rates higher than many free populations in neighboring countries. Their children were attending universities. Some became successful business owners, government officials, and community leaders. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because Sultan Qaboos understood that ending slavery wasn't just about changing laws. It was about rebuilding human dignity from the ground up. The question this raises for every modern nation is uncomfortable but necessary. If one leader could end centuries of institutionalized human bondage overnight and successfully rebuild entire communities, what's stopping other countries from addressing their own systems of exploitation and inequality? What's our excuse for accepting injustice that we have the power to change right now? In 1970, oil experts estimated Oman's proven reserves at over 5 billion barrels. At today's prices, that's roughly $400 billion worth of liquid gold sitting beneath the desert sands. Most rulers would have seen dollar signs and started planning golden palaces. Sultan Qaboos saw something completely different, a chance to build a civilization that could survive long after the last drop of oil was pumped from the ground. While his neighbors were literally building monuments to their own wealth, Qaboos made a decision that oil consultants called economic suicide. He allocated 30% of all oil revenues, not profits but total revenues, to education and healthcare. His advisors were honestly horrified. International petroleum consultants warned him he was throwing away Oman's future. Here's the comparison that will blow your mind. In the same decade that Qaboos was building schools and hospitals, the UAE was spending oil money on the world's tallest building, artificial islands shaped like palm trees, and indoor ski slopes in the desert. Saudi Arabia was funding massive military purchases and building cities where princes could race supercars. Kuwait was creating sovereign wealth funds that made rich families even richer. But Qaboos was playing a completely different game. Instead of asking, how can I get richer faster? He was asking, how can my people survive when the oil runs out? This wasn't just forward thinking. It was revolutionary in a region where oil wealth typically created massive inequality and long-term economic disaster. The numbers are staggering. Between 1970 and 2000, Oman spent over $60 billion on education alone. That's actually more per capita than Switzerland spent on education during the same period. They built 1,200 schools in 30 years. That's roughly one new school every 9 days for 3 decades straight. By comparison, oil-rich Nigeria built fewer than 500 schools in the same time frame, despite having 50 times Oman's population. But here's where it gets really interesting. While other Gulf states were importing foreign workers to do everything from construction to healthcare, Qaboos insisted on training Omanis for every job possible. This policy, called Omanization, seemed economically inefficient in the short term. Why spend years training local doctors when you could hire Egyptian physicians immediately? Why build technical colleges when you could import Pakistani engineers? The answer reveals Qaboos's genius. He understood that sustainable development isn't about importing solutions. It's about, building local capacity to solve problems. Every Omani doctor trained meant one less family dependent on foreign expertise. Every local engineer meant knowledge that would stay in the country even during economic downturns. The healthcare transformation was particularly remarkable. In 1970, Oman had exactly 2 hospitals and a life expectancy of 49 years. Infant mortality was among the world's highest, roughly 180 deaths per 1,000 births. Malaria, tuberculosis, and preventable diseases killed thousands annually. By 2010, Oman had built a healthcare system that rival Western nations envied. Life expectancy had jumped to 77 years, higher than the United States. Infant mortality dropped to 9 per 1,000 births, better than many European countries. The World Health Organization ranked Oman's healthcare system 8th globally for overall performance, ahead of Germany, Canada, and Australia. Here's the kicker. Oman achieved this while spending less per capita on healthcare than Americans pay just for health insurance. The secret wasn't throwing money at problems. It was building systematic solutions that addressed root causes rather than just treating symptoms. The education revolution was even more dramatic. Oman went from just 10% literacy in 1970 to an incredible 95% literacy by the year 2000. Honestly, the fastest educational transformation in recorded human history. But Qaboos didn't just focus on basic education. He established specialized universities for engineering, medicine, and technology. And he created scholarship programs that sent thousands of Omanis to study at Harvard, Oxford, and MIT, with the requirement that they return home to teach others. The economic impact became clear by the 2000s. While other oil-dependent economies collapsed during price downturns, Oman maintained steady growth because its educated population had created diversified industries. Tourism, manufacturing, logistics, and financial services provided alternative revenue streams that just didn't exist in neighboring countries. Here's the comparison that proves Qaboos was right all along. In the year 2020, when oil prices crashed during the COVID pandemic, the UAE's economy shrank by 6.1%. Saudi Arabia's contracted by 4.1%, and Kuwait's fell by 8.9%. Oman's economy, on the other hand, grew by 2.5%. But perhaps the most telling statistic is this. Oman's Gini coefficient, the measure of wealth inequality, is 0.32, indicating relatively equal wealth distribution. Compare that to Saudi Arabia at 0.45 or the UAE at 0.41. The country that spent oil money on palaces and luxury created massive inequality. The country that spent oil money on people created shared prosperity. The lesson here challenges everything we think we know about resource wealth. Natural resources aren't a blessing or a curse, they're raw materials. What matters is whether leaders use them to build monuments to themselves or foundations for their people's future. Qaboos proved that the smartest investment isn't in gold or stocks or real estate. It's in human potential. For 50 years, Sultan Qaboos did something that political scientists said was impossible. He proved that one leader making bold decisions without the approval of committees or voters could transform an entire civilization faster and more completely than any democratic process in history. But here's the deeper truth that challenges everything we believe about power and progress. Qaboos succeeded not because he accumulated more wealth or built bigger monuments than other leaders. He succeeded because he understood that true power comes from making your people more powerful. Every school he built created teachers who could build more schools. Every doctor he trained could train more doctors. Every engineer he educated could design better infrastructure. This is the paradox that Western political theory still can't explain. The leader who gave away the most power by educating his people to think independently became the most beloved ruler in the Middle East. The man who could have lived like a pharaoh chose instead to live like a teacher, and in doing so, created something more lasting than any pyramid or palace. If this changed how you see leadership development or the relationship between power and progress, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't tearing down the old system. It's building something so much better that the old system becomes irrelevant. Next, we're traveling to a place where ancient tribal councils make decisions that put modern governments to shame, and where thousand-year-old wisdom is solving problems that Western democracy can't even address. Remember, wherever life takes you, home isn't just a place, it's a perspective. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Your curiosity makes these stories possible, so keep exploring, keep dreaming, and we'll see you in the next adventure, right here on Beyond Borders.